All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we've got a really fascinating educational case study designed specifically for you as future business leaders. We're going to focus on an absolutely critical, yet honestly often overlooked phenomenon: how institutions frequently fail to see harm that doesn't fit neatly into their pre-built categories. Basically, we're looking at what exactly happens when the systems we rely on every day are fundamentally blind to certain realities. So, what happens when a system is literally built to miss the harm right in front of it? Look, I want to start with this question because what we're looking at today isn't some story of cartoon villains twisting their mustaches in back rooms. It's actually much more complex and, frankly, way more common. It's a look at structural blind spots that can lead to massive systemic failures. We're talking about situations where institutions are staring right at a problem, but because of how they're wired, they completely fail to recognize it as a harm.
Now, to really grasp this, we need to plainly define intersectionality. The term was coined back in 1989 by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, and she used this brilliant traffic intersection metaphor that just hits the nail on the head. Imagine a literal traffic intersection, right? If an accident, the harm, comes from two directions at once, but the law only lets you blame one specific road, well, the person hurt in the middle gets absolutely nothing. If a system can only process one category of harm at a time, the combined specific harm someone experiences just becomes totally invisible to that system.
Let's ground this theory in a concrete historical precedent so you can see exactly how it plays out. We're going to look at a 1976 employment lawsuit brought by 5 black women led by Emma DeGraff and Reed against General Motors in St. Louis. This case perfectly illustrates Crenshaw's intersection metaphor in action within the American legal system.
Okay, so here's the setup. Before 1964, General Motors' workforce in St. Louis was completely segregated, and it was divided along 2 very distinct lines: race and sex. The industrial factory jobs down on the floor went exclusively to men. Meanwhile, the clerical office jobs went exclusively to white women. This rigid structure effectively froze black women out of both tracks entirely. I mean, they couldn't get on the floor and they couldn't get into the office.
So let's trace the steps of what happened next. Because these women were historically excluded, they were only recently hired by GM in the late 60s and early 70s. But then, a recession hits in 1974. General Motors had this totally neutral-sounding, last hired, first fired seniority rule in their union contract. But, because black women were the absolute last hired due to past exclusion, this supposedly neutral rule meant they were entirely wiped out of the workforce during the layoffs.
Now, when the women sued, GM used a highly memorable defense hook. They successfully argued there was no discrimination happening whatsoever. Their logic? Well, they pointed to the factory floor and said, hey, we hire black people, look at the men on the floor. Then they pointed to the offices and said, and we hire women, look at the white women in the office. Because they hired some black people and some women, they argued they couldn't possibly be discriminating against black women.
And amazingly, the U.S. District Court totally agreed with GM. The court dismissed the claim, ruling that the women couldn't combine race and sex into one single lawsuit. The judge stated that doing so would create a super remedy that the drafters of Title VII never intended. The plaintiffs were basically told, pick a lane. You can sue for race discrimination or you can sue for sex discrimination, but you absolutely cannot do both.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that this wasn't a judge simply expressing some personal bias. No, this was a structural limitation of how the law categorized discrimination. Because the system was built on single-axis categories, race or sex, the highly specific combined harm experienced by black women just fell completely through the cracks. It was legally invisible. The system quite literally had no slot for it.
Section 1. The Modern Echo, Flint, Michigan. Now let's pivot away from the courtroom and look at Flint, Michigan, a majority black and deeply impoverished city, to see how institutions act on the voices they are inclined to hear today.
Our timeline starts in April 2014. During a severe financial crisis, a state-appointed emergency manager decided to save the city some money, roughly $2 million a year, by switching Flint's water source. They disconnected from Detroit's Lake Huron water supply and switched to drawing water from the local and highly corrosive Flint River.
Well, almost immediately after the switch, residents are sounding the alarm. They reported that the water was brown, foul-smelling, and tasted awful. People are experiencing skin rashes and hair loss. There were multiple boil water advisories for bacteria. Yet, despite these urgent, continuous complaints, city and state officials repeatedly assured the public that the water was completely safe to drink, essentially dismissing the residents' concerns for over a year.
And this brilliantly illustrates the blind spot we've been talking about.
In October 2014, General Motors, which still had an engine plant in Flint, complained that the water was so corrosive it was actively ruining their engine parts. Guess what happened? Almost immediately, officials granted GM permission to switch their plant back to the clean water. This accommodation cost the cash-strapped city $400,000 a year, but the ordinary residents, they were left on the corrosive river water.
Just looking at this timeline, you can see this glaring one-year gap between October 2014, when the corporation's property was protected, and late 2015. It wasn't until independent scientists like pediatrician Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha finally forced the issue by proving the water was leaching lead into children's bloodstreams that things changed. It took until October 2015 for the city to finally protect the people and switch back to Detroit water.
And you know what's wild? There is a poignant question reportedly asked by the GM workers themselves back at the plant. They were using that same tap water for their coffee and showers, and they asked, if the water is too corrosive for an engine, what is it doing to a person? I mean, it captures the absurdity of the situation perfectly. The harm was right there, plainly visible to anyone who chose to look.
Now, we need to be really clear here. GM's switch was a perfectly rational business decision to protect their equipment, and officials weren't setting out to deliberately poison anyone. Rather, the true institutional failure, the villain here, if you will, is the contrast in institutional responsiveness. It's about how incredibly fast a powerful corporate actor's concern gets addressed versus how long marginalized community voices are completely ignored, even when they're complaining about the exact same water.
Section 2, the leadership imperative, learning from failure. This brings us to the explicit through line for you as future business leaders. Both the 1976 GM case and the Flint water crisis teach us the exact same lesson. Institutions act on the harms they're built to recognize, and they act on the voices they're naturally inclined to hear.
So, as you build and lead organizations, you've got to ask yourself some tough practical questions. First, beware the category trap. Where might your diversity metrics look completely fine on paper while actively hiding intersectional harm? Second, look at escalation. What truly determines which complaints move fast inside your organization? Is it the actual merit of the complaint, or is it the power of the messenger? Remember, fair on paper isn't enough. Neutral policies can easily inherit past inequities. You have to actively design systems that can actually spot these gaps.
Because look, if you don't build systems designed to catch these structural blind spots, the real price of dismissing inconvenient complaints from less powerful stakeholders is incredibly high. In Flint, it led to a catastrophic public health failure and massive, lasting reputational damage. Ignoring these blind spots isn't just an ethical failure, guys. It is a massive organizational risk.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to reflect on as you step into your own careers. Look closely at the processes, the HR departments, and the reporting structures you will one day manage, and ask yourself, what systemic harms are your systems built to miss? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it changes how you look at the institutions you'll lead tomorrow.